Hello and welcome to Lesson 2, Part 1 of how to use a comparator mirror. These lessons are basically designed to show you that the nuts and bolts of realistic painting and drawing technique are very simple when you break them down. It is not a magic trick or rocket science. It's a process, pure and simple. And what's more, my research into the comparator mirror seems to indicate that it will allow anyone to approach these processes with confidence from start to finish. And it's confidence that makes all the difference where painting is concerned. To recap then, there are three fundamental issues at stake in achieving a purely realistic looking oil painting. You may remember that the first is the problem of shape or composition. Is everything in the right place? The second is the problem of tone or light and dark. And the third problem, the problem we're going to include today, is the problem of colour. Now you might notice that do colours look right seems a bit of a flat-footed criteria in comparison to our other two, but that is what this problem boils down to. It's subjective, the most subjective of our problems, which doesn't mean most difficult. It just means most dependent upon your particular preferences for one colour or another, or your ability to see colour where other people cannot. In any case, the comparator mirror should allow us to begin to train that instinct to see colour, and that's all we really want to achieve with our first few paintings. Okay then, let's start with our second lesson by talking about paint mixing on the palette. As I said in the first video, we do this before we begin to paint so that some of the fundamental issues have already been sorted out before we even start to put paint to canvas. In this instance, we're going to have solved the problems of tone and we're going to have solved most of the problems of colour before we begin to paint. And after I've had my coffee. So we've got titanium white, as we did last time. Rather than black, we've got burnt umber. It's a brown, a very dark brown. I'll explain why in a minute. Then we've got the three colour elements. The first is cadmium yellow. It's a nice warm yellow and it mixes well with the cadmium red, which is in the same family. They're both nice warm tones and mix well together. The third colour is French ultramarine, which here looks very dark. Actually, you get a truer sense of the colour by looking at the tube. If it's thinned out with white, or if it's used as a glaze, a thin transparent layer, it gives you a nice sky blue. If it's used thickly, it's very rich and dark. There's the white spirit. That's going to be used for cleaning the brushes and manipulating the paint on the canvas, as I explained in the first video. The first of our brushes is the old round hog's hair, tattered old thing. The second is our 3mm filbert brush for our finer detail. We're going to try and resist using that until later on. And then for blending, our flat synthetic sable brush with a short handle. Next, I splashed out and bought a palette knife. I'd forgotten my other one when I did the other painting, but there you go, make things easier. And our image of Robert Redford, exactly the same image as previous, but this time in colour, of course. And last but not least, our piece of rag. That's going to be used for cleaning the brush. Very important to clean the brush on occasions so that you're not muddying up your colours. And last but not least, our comparator mirror setup. And I'm just fixing the image there onto the back of the comparator mirror. And the more observant amongst you will see that I've had to print the image in reverse. So let's get down to business and start mixing the paint. So I'm taking the cadmium yellow and I'm mixing it into the titanium white and just taking a wild shot at trying to get a colour match on something, one of the lighter tones in the image. And as in the first video, I'm checking my colours back and forth, and when I'm happy with them, I'm placing them somewhere neatly on the side of the palette. It turned out that by fluke that was a perfect match for the lightest light in the hair colour, and that gave me a clue. Once I'd mixed the hair highlight, I knew that the flesh highlight wouldn't be that far away from it. I could see that. All I had to do was mix in a little bit more of the cadmium red, and I ended up with what I wanted. Then I'm mixing down with more cadmium red to achieve a richer pink, which I may not even use, but I just had a hunch that I wanted a tone very slightly down from the highest highlight flesh colour, and so there it is. You can see that what I said about this being a subjective business is borne out by watching me mix these colours. I'm making decisions on the fly, and as I go along I'm learning more and more about the kind of chromatic territory that we're in. This is my second attempt to mix colour for the cheek here, and my first attempt I got way along into the process and mixed up probably 4 or 5 times too much colour before realising that my base, that orange that I mixed up to begin with, had too much white in it. In fact, what you can see with this colour mix is that I included no white at all. I mixed up an orange and then I adapted it. And I found that that was a good process for doing most of the other colours apart from the very lightest lights. Certainly this one started from a darker orange. It may have looked like red, but it had a touch of yellow in it. And then I brought it down with the burnt umber. I could also have used my French ultramarine to do a similar thing, except that when you include a blue in a paint mix, you begin to cool the colour down even though you are darkening it. And I definitely didn't want to do that. So that was the reason why I used burnt umber here. Also worth pointing out at this stage that I'm creeping toward the colour I want each time by adding tiny increments. Look at that, that's not very much paint at all. As for my actual colour selection, you might very well ask why, out of the hundreds of colours available to me at my local art shop, did I choose these 5? Well, for warm flesh tones, this is the very basic setup. In fact, these colours aren't that much different to the ones that we all encounter in the school art class. But although we won't be able to achieve a really bright green or a rose pink or a turquoise with these colours, I do think it gives you the best bedrock from which to build complexity into your process as you begin to get more confident. So now I'm starting to think about colours for the hair, and because I fluked that first highlight, the very first colour I mixed, I knew that I'd mix up a yellowy orange as my base colour and then adjust, and you can see that's what I'm doing here. There's no great academic process in play here. I'm just mixing my colour bit by bit, creeping closer to what I think is the right colour, and then I'm just comparing back and forth. So my tip with paint mixing, my fundamental tip, is be more stupid. Let the image and the comparison with the paint do the hard work for you. And when you get the paint match, put it to one side and move on to the next colour. Last of all, this is the reason why I'm using burnt umber and not black. If you mix it with the French ultramarine in even quantities, you will actually end up with a black that is richer than anything you'll get from a tube. Most painters will tell you that. And if you're making a colour painting, if I'm making a colour painting, I would always choose to mix my black from burnt umber and French ultramarine, because it just gives you a depth that you wouldn't get any other way. And then very last of all, I'm just arranging the colours as I think I find the most useful on the palette. These on the left of the screen are the hair colours, and the ones on the right, if you remember, are the flesh tones. So there we are. Everything's laid out, clean back, ready to paint. And most importantly, let's take a moment to remember that in doing this, we've solved some of the fundamental issues to do with tone and to do with colour before we've even started to put the paint on the canvas. Next, I'm going to take a few moments to contemplate the source image with you, and then we can get on with the business of painting. What we've got here is a colour photograph taken in the 60s or perhaps early 70s, which bears all the hallmarks of colour photography from that period. You can spot it, can't you? Whether or not you know anything about photography. The colours are not quite as you see them with your eye. They're not quite as they appear in the real world, and that's because the colour sensitivity of film at that point and the processes involved in developing it were relatively crude. And that makes for quite an odd choice of subject matter for a painting. I have a choice, essentially. I can either stick with exactly the colours that are there and end up with a painting that looks not like the world, but like a photograph, or I can invent colours. I can try to use my imagination to bring new life into this image, to make it do more than the photograph is doing. Interesting thing to think about. Oh, one more quick thing. I know I will get down to the painting in a minute, but here's a quick rundown of all the colours, exactly what I've mixed and how, so that I can reference them as I'm going along and you can keep abreast of what I'm using and what choices I'm making. So here we are, we're all set up, we've got something to paint on, a piece of paper that's been primed with PVA glue, our source image is attached to the comparator mirror, and now I'm just going to quickly demonstrate some of the techniques I touched on in my first video about how to apply and then manipulate oil paint on the surface of the picture. This is only possible because I've primed my painting surface with PVA glue, and that means that the oil paint can be pushed and pulled around with a moist, clean brush, and that's exactly what I'm doing here. I don't really know why I'm making these particular shapes, but just wanted to show you how after making quite crude brush marks you can refine them into quite sharp, crisp shapes, or, as I'm doing here, you can get rid of the whole thing and begin all over again, and that means that you can have an infinite number of goes at getting things exactly the way that you want to. This to me seems really important because so many people's fear about drawing and painting is a fear of getting things wrong and not being able to correct it, or not being able to spot your mistakes, and this process allows you to chew your mistakes over until you start to sort things out. You'll actually see that further on in this painting I tie myself in a knot about one particular problem, about the right eye, and have to take the whole area back and begin again and unpick my mistakes. So after 20 years of experience, I'm still making those mistakes. I perhaps just have a little more experience about how to rectify them and how to not feel disheartened when it happens. So what you're seeing applied here are skin colours number 4, and just around the far right hand side of the image I've applied skin colour number 6. Of course your colours are going to be slightly different to this. You will have made other choices to me depending on what image you're painting. But I want you to have a total understanding about how I am thinking about my particular painting. With this in mind, you should be able to see that a lot of the things I'm doing here are exactly the same as I did in my black and white image. So many of those skills are completely transferable. We just have the problem of colour in the mix as well. So I'm using my big round hog's hair brush, and I'm going to resist using anything else for at least another, half an hour, because it keeps me from getting too worried about the details. And I am able to put in a painted scaffold, which will then be blended, and after that point I'll be looking for anchor points, little areas that I can begin to work on. Still not detail, but just enough to begin to pull the image up to the next level. This is a good example. This is the profile of the edge of the face, or the negative space around the head, if you like. And it gives me a good chance to show exactly how the comparator mirror is used. As you can see, it's not tracing. I'm looking into the mirror and I'm comparing that image with the image I'm painting underneath. Then I'm being bold and I'm placing that mark. Now when I check back and forth in the mirror, I see that those marks aren't quite in exactly the right place, but that doesn't matter. It's oil paint. It can stay on the surface wet and be manipulated later down the line. By mixing all of my colours and getting my tones just right and getting everything together on the palette before even beginning to paint, the problem at hand now is one of simple placement, in technical terms at least. And of course this placement becomes more refined as we get closer to a photographic likeness. But what will begin to happen from this stage onward is that your image will seem to fall together on the picture surface without too much brain work from you at all. Of course, if you're looking over someone's shoulder and you don't know how to paint, this seems like magic, but we know it's not. It's pure logic. We separate the problems one from another, and then we tackle them one by one. And we can remain confident because we know not only how to solve those problems, but how to unpick our work so that we can have a second or a third or an infinite number of goes at remaking the solution, reinventing the solution until it is exactly what we, by which I mean you, are happy with. Anyway, that concludes Lesson 2, Part 1. To see Part 2 of Lesson 2 and to see the painting concluded, just follow the link below this video.